probably they will choose not to come to a public sector and move forward. So that is going on. The reform that we spoke about in terms of the new company law, the new commercial law, a new bankruptcy law will be coming through online. So all these are part and parcel of, how to promote and change the incentives for firms and for forward.
There are many other points also at challenges. I will come back to you, Dr. Raed, especially about the tax policy. Yes, it's important at this time to succeed in the diversification strategy. 2030 vision was, and I quote, a bold move from many experts. They say that it was very audacious for a kingdom that it was a little bit conservative in the changes. How they will address the main challenges? When we say the challenges, there are some institutions, maybe they are not ready. There are lack of coordination between policy making and policy implementation. Maybe the private sector is not big enough. The business climate is not ready. How really to face all those challenges?
Well, it is imperative that we actually face these challenges, because the dependence, obviously, on resources like oil is non-sustainable. Just one statistic will show you that 80% of households in Saudi Arabia, for example, get their wealth, their money from government spending. So we have reached, and as Fuad mentioned, by the way, this has been really on the government agenda for the past 40 years, but it hasn't reached, perhaps the utmost priority until now. And I was really encouraged to see the Deputy Crown Prince on TV just a few weeks ago, actually explaining it. And actually, the vision 2030, if you look at it, it has commitments. You say, we commit to doing this, 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 this. Now, is this realistic? I think so, because I mentioned earlier that Saudi Arabia really has a lot of untapped potential, whether it is in tourism, whether it is in the mining and metal, whether it is in the purchasing power of Saudi, the population, the market, and its access, also its position to Asia and the Middle East. So it has a lot of potential that we really can and will take advantage of.
One word only, we will finish with you. It came in a very troubling geopolitical era.
Yes.
How is that another challenge to come at this time?
I think if you look at maybe the history of some countries in the Middle East, is that we didn't concentrate on the economy, and we concentrated more on political aspects. I think it's important to push on both, because one is just two things in the same of the same coin, if you like, and so the economy is very important and very urgent, and we will push on this, I think, strongly.
Yes. Dr. Osama, they are emphasizing all of them in the private sector. So it is major to really highlight the role of the private sector in economic diversification, knowing that the most of GCC countries' economy, the private sector play a minimal role, maybe an exception of the UAE, but it's minimal. What is the importance of the role of the private sector?
I think it's very important first to recognize that the private sector cannot really flourish without having a substantial public sector reforms, and Hatem has mentioned some of them for the case of Saudi Arabia, and Raed for the case of Dubai and the UAE. I would like to say that this is the most difficult part, I think, of laying the path toward diversification, because in actually trying to reduce the size of the public sector, now that you have a much less rich source of financing from the oil sector as oil prices decline, as well as with the prospect of the exhaustion of the reserves. First is the wage. You have the wage bill and the transfers, and Hatem has referred to that. How then do you reduce that? And the challenge is how to move the labor from the public sector, nationals, and actually dealing with the problem of the employer of first resort, moving them to the private sector. And the education, of course, is important, but also other, I think, steps have to be taken, like unemployment insurance scheme and others. Second, it is very important, while the public sector is declining in size and importance, that we have a smart reallocation of expenditures towards education, towards physical infrastructure, towards those areas that Fuad and Rida have emphasized that are important to make the export sector flourish, as support for the export sector. But you need resources for that. So there has to be a reallocation in the composition of expenditure. Also, you need to have increased reliance on non-oil sources of taxation. That's very important. And we need to lay the groundwork from now. Perhaps at the beginning at low tax rates, but then as we move closer to the time when oil prices are lower or when we're reaching the exhaustion of reserves, higher tax rates, because it's really very time consuming. It's a very long process with long gestation period to have a proper tax system. Again, this is in the work of Fuad and Rida. So there's a lot of work to be done in public sector reforms to pave the way for diversification.
Mr. Rida, please finish drinking your water. It's important that the private sector flourish at this time. It needs, of course, a lot of implementation, policy making, the climate of the business, etc. But which sectors?
So basically, this is the $1 trillion question, right? Which sector you should go?
Yes.
I cannot tell you, like, name one sector, but I can give you its features, right? So at least, as we said, export orientation is important, so it should be a tradable sector, right? It should be a sector that is conducive to productivity gains, right? So if it's low-skilled, an activity that is the same today, tomorrow, or yesterday, that might not be a sector where you need government intervention, right? It needs to be a sector that has a lot of kind of linkages, spillovers with the rest of the economy. So it's not just thinking of one good, but if it's a complicated good that creates kind of a lot of inputs.
I know you don't want to give examples, but give us, for instance.
All right, so we can think of Singapore tried biotechnology, for example, right? Automobile industry was mentioned. This is a good that has a lot of inputs, actually tens of thousands of them. And by the way, we talked about services, right? It's not that, basically the difference between service and manufacturing now is thinning, right? There's a lot of electronic, a lot of software into car industry too. So.
But manufacturing is always costly. People are a little bit afraid to go there. They go for service more.
Yes. Well, that's the issue. It is known that, or at least there's a lot of data and empirical work on that, but manufacturing actually produces much more productivity gains. It's more conducive to that. Of course, as you said, it's more risky, and that's precisely why the incentives are such that firms do not go into it, right?
Yeah.
So that's what you need to create.
Another question is important. Dr. Osama maybe brought it back, and you also talked about it in the presentation, the intervention of the state. What is the role? How do you want to give up the economy to, gradually, of course, to the private sector, but without the intervention of the state? And if you want the intervention of the state, the hand should be tall or hidden? Or what is the role of the hand of the state in here?
At least our idea is not to have a leading hand, rather it could be hidden maybe, but sometimes it may not be good to have a hidden one. It should be maybe transparent, no? But then you have the accountability there too. So the idea is that if the state intervenes, it should intervene to correct market failures. So you can create the enabling business environment, but then let industries, especially service industries, let them thrive because the environment is there. You don't have to really intervene much. You don't have to create sectors. You don't have to create firms. The private sector will. But the industries like manufacturing, especially sophisticated, high-tech manufacturing, for the countries like the Gulf, where the income per capita is very high, so you cannot really create the sector that will have low-skilled workers and wages, because you won't have many people going there and working there at very low salary. So it has to be high tech, high manufacturing, and for these firms most likely won't go in and create them. So there has to be intervention of the state with different types of incentives, as Led'am mentioned earlier, how to make sure that the firms go there and create this. And you need really the workings of both the state and the market to make this happen.
About Dubai, I want really, and the UAE, to ask about the private sector. It's been years that it has its chance to grow in this state and in this country. How important the leadership here saw the role of the SMEs and to grow the economy and also to succeed the diversification.
Yes, I mean the SMEs, whether you talk about Dubai, UAE, or anywhere, they're the backbone of any economy, right? So what are the conditions for them to grow? And what kind of barriers do they face? If you do any survey, the first thing they'll tell you finance, right? So access to finance, which is logical and stuff. And therefore you need to deal with that in a market failure, if you want to look at it in that framework, and try and come up with systems whereby you close this gap. The second is access to market. The critical aspect for an SME is not actually to participate in today's global value chains, the way that trade has evolved, but how to come up the ladder of this value chain, right? So one could be an assembler, starts as an assembler, and then how you go up the ladder. And this is the challenge. And this is where the role of Dubai SMEs, for example, the Mohammed bin Rashid SMEs, is to try and help these people through incubating them here, and then opening those markets to them and having these connections, right? So it is a critical aspect in terms of not only reaching the market, but how once you are established in the market, how to climb the ladder rather than being part of a chain, be on the ladder. And that's the focus of policy.
In 2030 vision, Dr. Hatem, the plan seeks to enhance the generation of non-oil revenues. There are so many steps to that. They will be raising fees, traffic and public services. They will expand to the taxes. But the question here, it must to be done by the state, by the hand of the state. Do you think after decades, the state will leave this to other sectors, other members to lead the market?
Well, clearly, the government is the largest economic agent, so it has to have a leading, hand and all that. It has to make the change, right? Now, as was mentioned, I think the way to do that is for, improving doing business, improving the, if you like, the business ecosystem. And this is one of the things, by the way, that Sagia, where I work, we've been doing that over the past years in something called the Competitiveness Acceleration Program, which is, just to briefly plug it in, if I may, we essentially looked at all the competitiveness reports, and we did our own report. We did a mystery shopper program as well, to find out what are the issues that we really need to undertake in order to ensure that we are more competitive. And we've gotten a consensus and the support, obviously, of the Royal Court to move forward with this. And this is now being monitored monthly, by the way, in order to adhere to the objectives and the goals that we have set. Now, having said that, so this is one way, is essentially to open up the country and improve the competitiveness in terms of doing business, bringing in investments from overseas to get the transfer of knowledge and to get the money that you need. Also, when you have things that the private sector cannot afford, the government can come in, if you want to call it natural monopoly, and you can't afford it. So the government starts in and then brings in the private sector slowly. Now, the private sector, at the end, they have to take on the burden of being the vanguard of economic development and all that. And they have to pay certain taxes, which I think you're going to come up to that. And that will help support the, the government income as well.
We've been circulating around it, and it's time to talk about this tax policy. The question is, Dr. Usama, this region has been for decades very attractive for all kind of investment and labor to come, and the expats especially. Isn't it going to a tax policy will shadow this advantage for the GCC, and how it will be benefit the economy here?
Actually, if you look at the research done that probes the private sector expectations and preferences, I think the investors look at the overall economic framework of the countries, of the GCC countries, and ask, is it sustainable? For example, if they see that taxes are low or there are no taxes, but the fiscal framework is sustainable, you will not have investment. Recently, you had Moody's, for example, making an assessment of one of the GCC countries and saying, well, it's the fiscal framework, even though the taxes are very low or non-existent in some sectors, nevertheless, the outlook is very bleak, and they're considering downgrading the rating of the country. So I think for the private investor, what's important is transparent and predictable rules and regulations, a legal framework that is sound, a tax system that is very clear, and overall the profitability over the longer run is one that is positive. And I would say in the fiscal area, it is very important to have a medium-term or longer-term framework. So at least the private investors not only have a good idea what the government will do in this year, not only to have a cash-based budget or a one-year budget, but a medium-term. And even if there are taxes involved, I think as long as it's very clear and that there is predictability and that there's transparency of the framework, then you will have the private sector come in.
But Mr. Rida, how this equation should work to have taxation gradually, eventually in this era, and also to be to have the advantage to be attractive in those GCC countries?
I guess the important thing to note is that when you look at surveys of multinationals, right, about why they decide to go into certain locations,
yes,
actually taxation is not the most important feature, right? What they look for is actually highly skilled workers, right? Good engineers, of course the environment, the infrastructure. So I guess, yes, it's not the only way, and might not be even the most important way to attract firms.
How do you think, Mr. Fuad, based on your experience and other experience in different countries that mainly you studied, to gradually instate the taxes in those countries? Should it be in some sectors or all the sector at one time? What should be done?
Well, overall, usually, I mean, you want to have some sort of simplified taxation regime, so it's easier to see what the US may not be the best example here, right, in terms of taxation, but a relatively easier taxation regime. And then the question is, you can use taxes to encourage certain activities and discourage certain activities. That's from simple economic theory. Like vice tax on different types of activities, and excise taxes, right? You talking about even hamburger taxes and so on. So the question is, you can have this type of taxes, or you can have corporate income taxes and so on. In today's world, globalized world, it's much harder to have corporate tax because money can move around much easier. So the question is, from the diversification perspective, you look at it, because you can design good tax policy, and there are different reasons, redistribution and so on. But if I look at it from the diversification perspective, well, you want to encourage exporters, right? So you don't want to probably tax these guys, right? And actually, VAT tax is one way it's exempt from exports. And then you have, well, you want to maybe tax non-tradables. I mean, Singapore even now has huge luxury tax on cars. So it's like the cars are very expensive, like high-end cars are very expensive in Singapore. So you can tax the luxury goods. So usually they say you should have the same VAT flat tax, I mean same flat VAT tax, but nowhere it says you don't have.
It's a very, very important strategy to have a tax policy, Dr. Raed, but how important to have a coordination of the whole GCC region to implement the taxes, to, of course, succeed this diversification shift.
I'll get to your diversification.
Okay.
First, like you noticed that the questions and the answers were about, no, taxes are not bad, right? So we're coming from a negative approach. They're not bad. Okay. So what's good about them? Right? Are they just a source of revenue? We can find, taxes and other source of revenues through fees, through import duties, through whatever, other means. And that's an important issue, right? So they say, the first thing is not to be defensive, say they're bad, they're not bad, right? Now, the coordination issue. The coordination is there, and it makes sense because an outcome of a coordinated policy is always preferable to every actor acting on itself, on himself, with himself. So whether you talk about a tax system, or an import duty, for the whole GCC, right, and a common external trade policy, and a common currency, all these things have their advantages. And within a tax system, leakages, people can think about leakages. But look, experience within Europe, you have different VAT rates across countries that have no borders, and yet the leakages are not there, or people did not move from high jurisdiction to a low jurisdiction. But nonetheless, from a cooperative perspective, yes, it makes sense to move all in the same way. But let's decide to move first.
Well, you said that we shouldn't. I will stay with you, Dr. Raad. We shouldn't be on the defensive. This is not bad, or in what means it is good to have taxation.
No, you're trying to turn the table on me, right? That is exactly what I asked, because they said, oh, it's not bad, so what's good? That's I leave it in the open.
Okay, Dr. Hatem.
I think you may be able to argue that some taxes actually good and related to diversification. So value-added taxes, for example, can make firms more efficient in the sense that you don't have to put in taxes at each process, at each input, at each step. So it makes it more efficient, and you can obviously compete, and you can export, perhaps you become more of a formidable exporter. So that's one thing. The other thing, I think that the GCC, but it's perhaps not related to diversification, but it's a good tax, at least, from my perspective, is that the GCC, many countries are actually looking at sugar tax, because because we have a high diabetes, in the region. And one of the ways that they're trying to do that is actually put some taxes on, on sugar. Also smoking and all that, taxes on that as well. That is helpful for society overall.
Dr. Usama, always taxes brings a lot of discussion and debate. People agree or don't agree. How is that related to growth and diversification? In what aim?
Well, let me just say, just as a follow-up to what Raed and Hatem have said, in terms of very soon, for many of the GCC countries, it won't be an option. They will have to raise taxes on the non-oil sector, simply because we cannot rely anymore on the revenue from the oil, because of both because of the fluctuations in the price of oil, but also because of the depletion.
But Dr. Raed said there are many other ways, different ways to raise the taxes, not specially called taxes, but it's something else.
But still, I think first, we have discussed in this session the role of the government, the leading hand, and I think Fuad and Rida have presented an important role. Education is one of them. Education is costly. I mean, if you want to have really high quality education, if you want to have vocational training, if you want to have the infrastructure that is needed to promote the export sector, it's not enough just to reshuffle the expenditure. You have to have an important source of revenue, and non-oil taxation will be important. I think given the agenda of the state, if it's really to be effective in enabling the export sector, in a diverse export sector, it's important to have the resources. And we cannot anymore rely on the oil. It's a very risky strategy, and for many of the GCC, it's not really a sustainable or feasible strategy.
So it's an obligation.
It is. I think it is. As I said earlier, first, we don't have to have high tax rates similar to those in developed countries. I think, for example, there's a VAT of the GCC that's going to be implemented in 2018. It starts at a very low rate. But at least we have to start with the infrastructure of the tax system, so that when the time comes where the non-oil sector has to be relied upon, because the oil sector is shrinking so much, then we won't face a crisis.
You have follow-up, Dr. Raed?
I'm all right. I'm all right.
Oh, you're right. Okay.
Yeah, I'm all right.
I get the
When it comes to taxes, I reserve my judgment.
The whole area is reserving their judgment on the tax policy issues.
I was very clear in terms of why and why now, for example, right? And there are reasons. One could list a number of them. But this is a sea shift. It's not just about the immediate impact on foreign investors. It's not the immediate impact on SMEs or export or whatever. But it's also a medium to long-term strategy. So it's not just another policy that you introduce.
Yeah, but
it's an uncertainty that comes with it.
But gradually, you don't think that we will come to that? At least the introduction on some term of sector, like Mr. Fuad said, and then we will go to others.
He was referring maybe to the rebates and all the for exports.
Exemption of the exports. All the other could be taxed. This is what he said.
Sure. It's one option amongst a number of other options, right? So it's not like where we studied, they taught us that two things that are inevitable. It's death and taxes. I'm trying to avoid at least one of them.
It's important to talk about human resources in this. When we are talking, all this will be implemented by human resources. Mr. Rida, what need to change to divert capital and especially human resources from the hydrocarbon sector to other sectors like manufacturing, finance, service, tourism? Can you convince them to shift to that and to be ready as well for this new aim?
Well, first, there has been already a lot of investment, right? There is something already. Yes. There's already talent, people, and young people taking on those fields, right? The issue up to now has been the lack of the employment in those sectors. So let's say we'll come together, right? Once you start working on basically putting an environment, I don't know, startup incubators, things like this, to create the employment, right? Well, people will shift naturally, right? If I know I'll be working in, let's say, some kind of a Silicon Valley of Dubai, for example, right? I know it exists. I know the jobs are there, the opportunities. Well, I'll shift all my training, right? Early on, I'll go into those fields. So I think they come together, right?
Is it very important for the human resources to be ready to make and to implement a good business climate or environment?
I guess you need to have, of course, for the industries to flourish, especially, as we discussed earlier, that you don't really need too much state intervention, to create the industries, right? So as Rida mentioned, a good example is maybe Algeria. Right? They actually created a lot of engineers very fast after the independence. But at the same time, there was not many industries for them to go into. So in a way, this kind of gives you, so it's not really skills first, industries later. It's actually simultaneously. Because you want, after these guys graduate, where are they going to work? Another interesting example is actually Ireland in the 70s, later also Irish Development Agency. When all the firms came in, especially from the US, pharmaceuticals, engineering, and so on, they didn't have enough engineers. So what did they do? They created a program, 2-year program, and they basically took the physics majors and made them engineers in 2 years. And all these guys went and started working for all these firms. So you can even restructure and adapt the current environment, so you don't have to create a new one.
Well, about the labor training, maybe for the UAE doesn't apply a lot because they are already ready, and you talked about the reform in the education.
Yeah, ready, on their way.
Different.
Listen, the matter here is about what? If you were to think about diversification as, having more and more number of goods and services produced, there is another way of thinking about it, right? Same number, or even restrained number, but high quality, right? Different varieties of the same thing. And this is one model, and if you see manifestations of it around us, not just within Dubai and the UAE, Right? So you have 5-star hotel, let's make it a 7-star hotel. Now, what is the challenge in this case? Is to see the longest quality ladder that you can think of, right? So you can go into products, start at a small technological sophistication, if you will, but the quality ladder actually provides you with opportunities to learning by doing, and then moving up the value chains and the technological ladder. That's diversification, but in a different, perspective. I mean, it qualifies as diversification. It's not just the number, but it's the quality.
How it is happening in the UAE.
This is exactly the model here,
of
right?
the model.
So it's not about the number of services or goods that are being provided, but the qualities of even restrained number of goods and services that are being achieved. And as you say, when you say, okay, the building that we're in, what is it? It's pushing a quality. It's pushing a standard, a benchmark. The same goes for what is it? The hotel, the 7-star hotel. It's pushing the quality ladder, right? And that's a diversification.
The human resources.
And of course, within it, to distinguish from other competitors.
It's very important to talk about the human resources in the KSA because in Saudi Arabia, most of the labor, yes, they are trained, but they are attracted by the public institution. How to train them now for the SMEs and